I am an avid listener of KNKX, the public radio station, as I'm sure many of you are, listeners of the public radio station where you are, because that is the demographic of the UCC. I think that's a pretty safe bet. And as we all know then, they recently had a huge amount of their funding clawed back, not just stopped for future years, but funds that they had been told were coming and allocated to public radio, to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, have been taken back. And so they suddenly had about a $60,000 hole in their budget. This is just KNKX, not all of the other stations. So of course, they started their fundraising appeals, and good for them, good for them. KNKX has a really rich history of listener support. They're the radio station that went from being supported by a university, KPLU, to becoming independent successfully. And they have a huge bank of listeners who are committed to them. And I couldn't help but think, as I was listening to this NPR station raise funds for their $60,000, about all the other public radio stations around the country, ones in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Nevada, who don't have the luxury of 3 radio stations that cover the same essential metro area, but the one public radio station that's for the whole state. And I couldn't help but wonder how those states were faring, how those public radios were faring. And I was really dismayed, actually, that the public radio station that I was listening to was only fundraising for itself, was only making sure that it was going to be solvent. And I don't know about you, but I am very invested in a country full of citizens who have access to good news. And I am very interested in a community approach to solving these funding deficits that don't just fund our already well-funded public radio stations. Now, obviously, that's one example, but it extrapolates over many, many in our society. When we have budget deficits or have a need, we focus on that one thing in our community, which makes sense, but it leaves all the rest of our communities untended to. This story, we find a rich farmer who has more than he needs, who had an abundant crop. And rather than think to himself, golly, my farmers did great this year. Wowzers, the earth really gave up her nutrients. Holy smokes, the rain and the sun and Creator's world all conspired to create this bumper crop. How shall I return it? Who shall I thank? How shall I give this away? He credited himself, and he thought about his own needs, his own silo, his own barns. And this story, I don't think, is about not storing for the future, not preparing for the future, not making sure you had enough. This rich man clearly had plenty because he already owned multiple barns in which to store his excess. So this farmer has created this year enough excess that they don't fit in his regular storage barns. And again, he doesn't think, how can I support my community? How can I feed those who maybe didn't have such luck? How can I acknowledge the fact that rich people don't become rich on their own, but enriching themselves on other people's labor, resources, extraction from the earth? Instead of returning some of that to others, to the community, to the earth, to God, he tore down his barns to build bigger barns. I did a little research on the storage industry for this sermon, which is a whole other sermon, it turns out, but holy cow, does our society spend a lot of money on storing our goods. It's in the billions, in case you didn't know. This man builds bigger barns to store his goods for the future. And they're not emergency goods. They're not just in case for a rainy day goods. They are goods to, quote, eat, drink, rest, and be merry. A life of luxury and excess. One area where I think of people storing things for a rainy day in our culture, in our society, is disaster preparedness. This is your reminder inserted into a sermon to make sure you have your go bag for the big earthquake that is probably going to happen during our lifetimes. When we think of emergency preparedness and storing things away and getting things ready for an emergency, I, like you, probably think of collecting items for your own personal use, for your own family storage, making sure you have extra meds for your family, making sure you have bottled water enough for your family for 3 days or more, making sure you have your supply. I'm not even talking about the whole prepper situation. That's like a whole other thing. But did you know that a huge part of emergency preparedness, I learned when I did some classes, is about community connectedness? That's almost more important than ensuring you have your own personal stuff taken care of. Community connectedness. Because they found that in actual emergencies, people do not hoard their supplies and only keep what's theirs. They share freely. They network. They make sure, they knock on each other's doors. They make sure everybody in their community has what they need to get through the emergency. And so one of the first steps, if you do emergency preparedness, is go meet your neighbors. Go map the neighborhood. Suquamish tribe, actually, part of their emergency response protocol is making sure communities have connections with each other, that neighborhoods are mapped, that everybody has each other's cell phones, that you get together. And so things like block parties and closing down the streets and community parades are a part of emergency preparedness. Things like our church's rummage sale, where not only people are collecting goods, but people are talking to each other, meeting their neighbor. That's a part of emergency preparedness. Our community dinners, worship each Sunday, knocking on people's doors when they are new to the neighborhood and bringing them a pie or your fresh plums from your tree. Those are all a part of community preparedness. And I think the piece that this rich farmer gets wrong is that the way to build wealth, the way to invest in his life, was to take what he had and put a wall around it for himself. And what I think emergency preparedness teaches us, and this scripture teaches us, is the way toward wealth is to open those walls and to share, to invest in community, to get to know our neighbors, to get to know the older woman who can't get out by herself, to get to know the family who has a disabled kid that needs assistance, to get to know who on your block is the nurse and who has special handyman skills and who is a firefighter or was a nurse in a former life. Investing in community builds wealth and resources. It builds a world that all have what they need. And I think often in our capitalist society, our focus is on making sure we have what we need. And the building community is considered extra. It's like a bonus if you have money. Our church sends 7 delegates, sometimes less, fewer, to an annual meeting where our church, our wider church, gathers in community. And that takes money. That takes sending people with their cars and gas. That takes lodging. That takes a conference center and tech support to have hundreds of people gather across the state. It's easy to start thinking that that's extra, that that's luxury, that that's not needed because we are here in our church. But there's an element of community building that happens when we share our resources, when we find out what each other are doing in our churches, when we build our community across the state together. There's the same thing that happens on the national level called General Synod, where we as a annual meeting conference in the Pacific Northwest send our delegates to the national body. They meet, they talk, they create community, they form networks. We build our wealth together that way, our wealth as a denomination. We sent 7 delegates, along with our general minister here from the conference, to the General Synod. And it's a week-long event where they discuss, they worship, they argue, they pass resolutions, they make proclamations, and they build our wealth. Rather than having all of our conferences siloed, independent, self-sufficient, hoarding our resources, it's where we share what we're doing, where we celebrate each other and how our churches are doing, where we mourn when churches are struggling or closing. It's where we create our barns together, our mutual barns. And of course, because we are a congregational church and we do all things by covenant, this annual body can be seen as superfluous because what they decide at the synod does not have to influence us. But because we are in community rather than in our individual barns, it's important to be aware of what they're discussing, what they've decided, and letting that guide us, letting that enrich our community. So I wanted to share a few of the things that they said, that they decided. They passed a resolution to oppose the current immigration policies in this country. There was a celebration of 25 years of ministry of the Our Whole Lives program, the human sexuality program that is led by a local person in our community, Reverend Amy, I forget her last name. And they rejected a proposed bylaw change, which would have allowed our associate general minister to be selected by the general minister instead of being voted on. That was a bylaw change that was made. And the synod said, no, thank you. We will continue voting on that. And it was an effort to streamline that process and make it less cumbersome. But as a body, our synod said that is not a bylaw change that we support. And there is one that I want to read to you because I think it's very important. Lily brought it up a few Sundays ago. And that's a resolution that was passed almost unanimously that is a declaration for an end to genocide in Palestine. There are multiple whereas here, which you are free to read, but I will not read those all to you. But I do want to read the following. Therefore, be it resolved that the 35th General Synod of the United Church of Christ adopts the following declaration. We affirm that all are made in God's image and are deserving of life free from oppression, persecution, and violence. We denounce all acts of the U.S. government and the State of Israel that contribute to a continuation of the genocide of the Palestinian people. We affirm that the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people perpetrated by the State of Israel and supported by the U.S. is a humanitarian crisis that calls for immediate action. We reject any theology or ideology, including Christian Zionism, supersessionism, anti-Semitism, anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, or anti-Islam bias that would privilege or exclude any one nation, race, culture, or religion within God's universal economy of grace. We affirm the obligation of the U.S. to recognize international law, immediately cease all sales and transfers of military arms and financial support to the State of Israel, and use all legal and diplomatic tools to help bring about a permanent peace to the land. It concludes, be it further resolved that we will share this declaration, pray, and speak within our congregations and communities about the genocide in Palestine. There's more here that I will leave out on the table for you to read. And as we think about the rich man and the farmer building his barns and building his silos and protecting what we have, but what he has, and our own United States policies that are building bigger barns and keeping our abundance for ourselves, as the world suffers, my prayer is that this church and each of us examine the ways that we are holding on to and hoarding abundance of resources that we have been freely given in this life, that we have in excess, that allows us to eat, drink, and be merry while others are starving. And my prayer is that this congregation finds ways, continues to find ways to break down those walls of those barns, to tear them down, and to share God's resources and abundance for all people. Amen.